Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Carefulist, the podcast. I am happy to welcome Nancy Meyers, who is an attorney and the founder of Advocord, to the show. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Katie. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. I'm so glad that you could be here today. We have some really crucial things to touch on for caregivers, and you are just the person to do it. So, with that in mind, we can dive right in. So, let's start with how you became interested in supporting those who are in need of caregivers.
Sure. So it really came about as a natural evolution of my practice. So I started my career actually in criminal law. I was a prosecutor for a while. And because my undergrad degree was accounting, I knew enough to be dangerous, I like to say. But I ended up doing some white collar prosecution as part of that, which includes some elder fraud cases. So I started seeing early on in my career how vulnerable people could really be taken advantage of by
Yeah.
those who are caring for them. And that was sort of one end of the extreme, obviously, the criminal aspect of it. As I went into private practice then, and I started practicing estates and trusts, so probate, um, estate planning, estate administration, things like that. I started working more and more with people who were in caregiving roles, but who had legal responsibilities. So these were the powers of attorney and the court appointed guardians. I've done a lot of guardianships. And I started seeing there a lot of most, if not exclusively, very hardworking, well-meaning people who sometimes made mistakes, not out of ill intent, but just because they didn't really know what they were doing. They were put into these fiduciary roles. They were held to the same standards as professional trust officers at banks. But they were just trying to help, and they were doing their
Yeah.
best while juggling their children, or jobs, full-time jobs, maybe their own health issues.
Mm.
And I just saw that struggle. So that's really what really motivated me to see where I and the legal profession could really help.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Number one, for using your expertise to do that, because I think a lot of caregivers fall into this bottomless pit of the unknown. And the longer you are in the caregiving role, you just keep uncovering layer after layer of responsibility. And on top of many people not being healthcare professionals, there is the legal and the financial aspect to it. And it's not easy to navigate by any means. It's very complex. So seeing what you've seen and knowing what you know, how have you been inspired um, by any of these caregivers that you've met in your practice?
Oh, well, there have been a lot who've inspired me. A few come to mind, and one in particular has a son who, suffered a traumatic brain injury. And just her level of dedication and the advocacy. And, when I first met them, her son's situation was pretty dire. And I've worked with them now over the course of, probably 11 or 12 years. And to see the progress that he has made in his ability and his ability to communicate and participate in life. And
Mm.
I know that is probably 99.9% attributable to his mother, just day in and day out, just going to bat for him, finding the
Mhm.
services that have really helped him. And that's inspiring to watch, because I think so many people think if I were ever in that position, I don't know what I would do. I would give up. I would just crawl in a hole, and
Yeah.
I couldn't handle it. And to see the reserves of inner strength that
Mhm.
people find when they have to, it is really inspiring.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. One of my friends, when I was first dealing with my mom's dementia diagnosis, said to me a quote that she had read somewhere, which was, "You never know how strong you are until you don't have a choice."
Mhm.
And it is the absolute truth.
Mhm.
when you have a choice, you go, "Mm-mm,
Right. Right.
there's no way I could handle that." And then you're in it and you realize just one step forward at a time, you are figuring it out and you are doing it.
Yep. Absolutely. And not only to just be reactive, but be proactive and really be an advocate. And that was a word that came up. It was funny because when I founded my company, we had all sorts of names for it. And, we were working with some marketing folks and
Mhm.
they didn't have a legal background. So I was trying to explain to them, fiduciary. I'm like, well, nobody knows what a fiduciary is. Um, and they said, well, really, what do these people do? And I said, they're advocates. That's what they are. They're constantly going to bat for the person they're caring for. And it's
Right.
not always a family member. Sometimes this is just a true friend that will step up and do this. So yeah, the advocacy of it is just really inspiring.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the interesting conversations I've had with some other folks this season of the podcast and just in general is just that you don't have to be a family member to be a caregiver. You just have to care and offer your expertise or your services or your support to someone who needs help. So there are a lot of people who are caregivers who don't realize it.
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. Yep. Mhm.
Um, so how have your experiences working with caregivers influenced what you're doing today? You teased it a little bit, but let's
I did.
let's let's
I
dig in there.
Okay. So through the years, advising people who were in these fiduciary caregiving roles, and let me just define that a little bit. So,
Yeah.
again, these are the people that have the legal responsibility. They may or may not take on the healthcare aspects of caregiving. They may not be the same people. I have many families who, one child is the one who is actually living with mom and taking care of her and doing that. And then another child, for whatever reason, maybe it's skill set or geography, or other family obligations, take on those legal responsibilities. And that's the bill paying. That's the, negotiating with the insurance companies. It's making sure that every benefit that they're entitled to, that application is done. So those are what I mean by the fiduciary aspects of caregiving. So, working with those people, I saw that they're thrown into this role. They have no guidance. They would come to me. And, I'm certainly not advocating, against my chosen profession of being an attorney, but, I they were paying me a lot of money to help them set up Excel spreadsheets, to track financial data, to keep track of the time they've spent. Because some caregivers can get paid for their work, even if they're family caregivers. Thankfully, there's momentum behind that right
Yeah.
now to recognize it as a valuable service that should be paid. And they were struggling with how to keep track of that. So they were paying me my hourly rate to set up Excel spreadsheets for them. And in the case of court-appointed guardians or conservators, depending on what state you're in, those folks have to do annual reports to the court that are then audited in some way, and they're held accountable. And sometimes they're called in front of the judge and say, hey, why did you spend this money? Or why did you do that? So there's a really acute need for good record keeping there.
Yeah.
And those people sometimes would show up in my office with boxes of the receipts that they accumulated over the past year, and we would sit around a big conference table and organize them. And again, I started thinking there has to be a better way. And then one of the other things that I saw repeatedly come up was the concern about, well, what happens when I can no longer do this? And this was usually
Oh.
in the case of parents who had children with cognitive limitations, some sort of intellectual disability, and they were worried, well, wait a second, what happens to those little quality of life bits of information I refer to them
Mhm.
as. So, I have one family with a severely autistic son, and their concern was, well, wait a second, we have the bank records, there's a trust, we that's kind of straightforward. We know where that information lives. Medical records are a separate thing. We know that. But
Mhm.
we know what his triggers are. We know what makes him happy. We know what makes him
Yeah.
smile. We know what movies he likes, what foods he likes. Where do we pass that information along? And I
Mhm.
started seeing where the legal profession really wasn't providing resources for people to do these things and address these
Mhm.
concerns. So I had a legal pad in my desk for about 10 years, just random notes
Yep.
um, about what we just talked about, various issues and challenges that people had. And I started looking for software to do it, and it didn't exist. And I thought, well, all right, why not me? Um, but I don't code, so yeah, it was. But I put together a team, and we built the software to address those concerns.
Mhm.
Um, the other piece I will say that a little less pleasant piece that comes into this is family strife. Whenever
Mhm.
you talk about caregiving, it's not all a Hallmark movie.
Right.
Um, there are a lot of times that siblings are at odds with each
Mhm.
other, various reasons. And I used to do a lot of litigation in that space.
Mhm.
I don't anymore because I don't have the time. But what I noticed was sort of a commonality in all those cases that ended up in court. And when they ended up in court, nobody won. I mean, it was
Right.
just a lot
Yeah.
of the emotional toll, the financial toll, all of it. And I looked at the commonality, and it was more often than not, somebody in the family felt that they were out of the loop, that there had
Mhm.
been a breakdown in communication. There wasn't an ability to share information. The child that was sort of hands off was fine with, her brother kind of managing the finances until the brother said, "Hey, we have to sell mom's house because she's out of money."
Mhm.
And I was like, "What do you mean she's out of money?"
Right.
Because if you're not directly involved, you don't realize how expensive it is to get old or
Yeah.
to be not well.
Right.
Um, and then all of a sudden there was this accusation. Well, what did you do with mom's money? Where did it go?
Yeah.
So that was the other piece of it to really build a record that could be shared so that it was transparent, it was accountable, that it really protected the person in the decision-making role to say, look, this is what I've been doing. Here are all the receipts. You can look at it. It's an open book.
Yeah.
I haven't been, lining my own bank accounts with mom's money.
Right.
These are the number of hours I spend. I want it to be able to track that because I don't think people realize if they're not a caregiver, the sheer amount of time that goes
Right.
into.
And your own money.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
There's so much coming out of your own pocket for
Mhm.
things that aren't covered, and
Yep.
their social security check doesn't cover, or whatever they've set aside. You go through it faster than anybody can imagine because of how expensive things are. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then just lost productivity at work.
Uh-huh.
So many people have to step away from a career
Yep.
or, turn down a promotion that requires more responsibility. So you have that lost earning plus the loss in retirement savings. I mean, it snowballs.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that was really the inspiration for me to create software to help address those problems. That the legal side of it. Um, yeah. And
Yeah.
and then I was going to say on top of it, there's so many requirements for eligibility for benefits. So Medicaid, for example, there are so many pitfalls there that can end up in disqualification from benefits, especially if you don't have good records. So that was another piece of it. I really wanted to support that process of caregiving, of saying, wait a
Yeah.
second, giving you the tools to really help you maximize the benefits to help offset that financial loss.
What an amazing tool for people to have. So can you say the name again for the
Mhm.
audience and where they can go to get some more information?
Sure. So the name of the company is Advocord, Advocord, and it's the combination of the advocate's record. That's what the name comes from. And they can go to our website, which is www.advocord.com. Um, there's a 30-day free trial. And then after that, it's $5 a month. It's It's actually $4.99. I will say that. I made the mistake. I was speaking to a group of judges about it, and I said it was $4.99 a month. And after I finished, one of the judges came up to me and said, "I love this. I would love to have our guardians use it, but I can't. I just can't order somebody to spend $500 a month." So I said, "Oh, okay. I messed up. I should have said $4.99." So yeah. So that's where you
Well,
can find information. And then we also have, as part of our website, so there's the software tool, but then there's also a public facing, no cost learning center, where I've worked with a woman in Pennsylvania who actually coordinates all the guardianship education for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And she and I built out really little 2-minute best practice videos on different topics,
yeah.
short little articles. Because, the funny part is when someone becomes a court-appointed guardian, in most states they're handed a handbook or given a
Mhm.
link to a handbook, and they average about 250 pages. Now, tell me in your caregiving journey, did you have time to read a 250-page handbook?
No.
Right. So, we wanted to make it okay, here are the highlights, here are the pitfalls, here are the things to look out for because you don't know what you don't know. And
Right.
really wanted to highlight, okay, these are the areas where there are traps for the unwary. Um,
Hmm.
so if you have real estate, for example, there are specific rules about what you can do with real estate.
Hmm.
And we just wanted to highlight those and make them very short, very easy to understand. We're not giving legal advice. We're not replacing attorneys. We're simply sort of raising a flag and say, okay, you know what? Here's a point where it would be worth it to pay for a consult
Yeah.
with a CPA or with an attorney. Um, because the
Right.
problem is if you do something wrong, it's going to be much harder and much more expensive to undo it.
Right.
Yeah, so we're trying to raise a little warning flag up front to say, here's where
Yeah.
you tread carefully.
Well, and that is so helpful because you don't know what you don't know.
Mhm.
So you come across something and you've become this very independent, I'm gonna get it done person. You can really do yourself some disservice and, you know, zero favors if you do it the wrong way.
Absolutely. And, especially with income qualified benefits, so Medicaid, for example, I've seen many times where people say, oh, well, yes, my mother has dementia, but she would definitely want to help pay for, her grandson's college. And, we talked about that. And so I'm just going to write that check and have it do it. And then all of a sudden they go to apply for Medicaid. And nope, they see it as a gift that now acts as a disqualification for benefits. So those are the types of things that, before that action is taken, you know,
Yeah.
a short consult with an attorney to say, well, wait, maybe there's a way to structure it where, you know, both sides can get what they need, but otherwise just sort of forging ahead without that knowledge can
Yeah.
ultimately really be detrimental to the person you're trying to care for.
Right. And so for the audience listening, you've mentioned Medicaid. Can
Mhm.
you talk about um, when that transition might happen or when the time to consider Medicaid is and what they may have been on prior to going to Medicaid?
Sure. So in the case of someone who's elderly and maybe has a dementia diagnosis, when they're looking to pay for skilled nursing care, I don't know what the average cost is where you are, but in our community, I mean, it's not unusual to see 12 and $14,000 a month for
Mm,
skilled nursing care. And, as you said, that money goes fast. People run out of funds. So, you have to look for sources of payment to be able to continue that care. Medicaid is that social safety net for folks who need it, who don't have
mhm.
funds, but it is income qualified. You can't just have $5 million one day, give it away to your children, and then the next day go on Medicaid.
Yeah.
There's a 5-year look back. So, in terms of record keeping, if you are looking down the road at someone who has a progressive diagnosis, for example, and you think, you know what, I'm not always going to be able to go over and care for mom in her house or even, have her live with me. At some point, she's probably going to need skilled nursing care. So you need to be looking forward and
Mhm.
to be looking 5 years forward. And actions you take today can really negatively affect that ability for her to receive that care. So, that's the thing with Medicaid is that what they call the spend down. Now, there are things that you can do legitimately and still preserve benefits. So, I always tell people go prepay a burial. If they're in their home, you can do improvements to help them stay in their home. There are certain expenditures that can be done. It's gifting that's really the big problem. And if everybody's been used to getting, the $10,000 check from grandma at Christmas, you might have to be the bad guy and say, grandma can't do that anymore.
Yeah,
And that's where good financial advice, good legal advice is crucial because there are repercussions that they may not rear their head today, maybe not
right,
even a year from now, but 4 years from now, you may really live to regret that. So, those are some of the pitfalls that we really want to alert people to and say, wait a second, there's a reason there are professionals who specialize in elder care and advising
right.
people in this space because there really are traps.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Ugh,
Yeah,
it's so complicated.
it is.
But you said something that makes me want to reiterate it, and that is finding people who specialize in elder care. Because if you don't specialize, even the professionals that you're seeking out don't always know, exactly the minutia. So if you're looking, you want to make sure that person is a specialist in the elder care space. The other thing is one of the themes that comes out of a lot of these conversations is looking ahead and thinking ahead and talking and planning early. You want to have these conversations while people are healthy and have a plan. Um, and I can't say that enough because it is the worst when you get caught with your pants down.
Yeah,
And, sometimes, depending on what happens, you don't have that 5 years.
right.
Um, so always good to have these conversations when you're healthy.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
go ahead. Sorry, what were you going to
I was
say?
going to say there's so many more options.
Yeah,
Yeah, early as opposed to later.
right. So early in our conversation, we talked about fiduciaries. Can you share what some fiduciary best practices are with us?
Sure. So record keeping is the first one. Not commingling funds, so a lot of times, I'll hear people say, oh, well, I'm just going to go have mom put my name on the account, and that'll just be easier. Okay. There are a lot of downsides to that. If you're the power of attorney, that power of attorney should, if it's drafted properly, going to allow you to engage in banking and make sure the bills are paid and, do all that you
Mhm,
need. So commingling funds is a no-no. Obviously, self-dealing is a no-no.
mhm,
Um, Now, that doesn't mean you can't get paid for your work. What I recommend though is seeing an attorney who does caregiver agreements. So
mhm,
you can absolutely, have a contract drafted where you are actually paid for the work that you do. Now, of course, it's taxable income to you,
mhm,
but as a fiduciary, again, keeping that above board, keeping that transparent is the way to go, as opposed to just saying, well, I spent X number of hours this month, so I'm just going to, move $5,000 out of mom's account into mine.
mhm.
That's going to be a problem because
Yeah.
you need to make sure that the paper trail supports. You really have to take a defensive posture when you're in a fiduciary role,
Mhm,
because you can be called upon, to account for your actions by family members, by the courts. by a nursing home. You go into that process, that intake process, and you meet with the social workers. They're looking, way back at all of bank
Mhm.
records. Want to know, how is this money being spent, and how will it be spent going forward? So, those are some of the best practices, that transparency, accountability,
Mhm.
um, not self-dealing. That's those are the big ones. Yeah.
Yeah. And so if we turn our focus then to estate planning, what
Mhm.
are some of the things that caregivers can do today in estate planning?
So it really has to start before you become a caregiver, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yep.
Um, I can't tell you how many times we get calls at my firm, from a caregiver, usually a child, an adult child, who says, I need power of attorney for my mother. And, the first thing we say to them is, well, why is your mother not calling? Because your mother's the one that has to grant it. Well, she has advanced Alzheimer's and she has nothing in place. Like, we can't help you. We can't draft a document for you that will give, you power of attorney over her. She has to do that.
She
So
has to consent,
she has
right?
to, and be competent to do it. I mean,
Yeah.
there is a level of cognition. I mean, every attorney has a process when we meet with a client.
Hmm.
We have to meet with them alone.
Hmm.
So many times, the caregiver will bring the client in, and, they start walking back to the conference room too. And I'll say, no, please wait in the waiting room.
Hmm.
And usually there's a look like, well, why? Well, because they're the client. Attorney-client privilege requires that we meet with that person alone. And then, I will go through, I have my own, process that I've developed over 20 years of doing this, of,
Hmm.
engaging in conversation and really trying to evaluate, does this person really understand why he or she is here?
Right.
Does she understand what she's doing, the potential pitfalls? Because anytime you give somebody power of attorney, that's a really risky thing. I mean, that
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
choice of a fiduciary is the most important decision you're going to make. I mean,
Right.
decisions in your will, by definition, don't affect you. You're gone. The power of attorney, and that's the decision that affects your well-being when you are potentially in your most vulnerable state.
Yes.
So that decision, you have to really understand that. So that planning has to happen while the person still has that ability. So I hope, and I'll throw lawyers, myself included, under the bus on this a little bit. I think we've done a terrible job of really educating people that once you turn 18 and become legally an adult, you need to start this process. We always tell our clients that have children going off to college, they need a POA. What do you mean? Well, young people get in accidents.
Yeah.
Sadly, people suffer traumatic brain injuries and all sorts of things, that diseases that, I mean, guess what? You're still their parent, but the law
Mhm.
doesn't see you as that. You know,
Right.
if you
They
go to
are
an,
an individual adult now, and you
they
can't make
are.
decisions on their behalf.
They are. And, you're going to run up against that brick wall called HIPAA if they're in an accident when they're 20 off at college and
Hmm.
there's nothing in place. So estate planning really needs to be a lifelong process. It,
Hmm.
it really does. Because when you're in need for it, there's generally one option, and that option is a guardianship or conservatorship.
Hmm.
And that is just the most drastic deprivation of civil rights that we see,
Hmm.
for someone who hasn't been convicted of a crime. Um,
Yeah.
it is where the court is saying you no longer have any legal capacity. So your signature on a line has absolutely no import whatsoever. And all that power, all that autonomy that we take for granted is now vested in someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you really want to avoid that situation if you
Right.
can. And, the best way to do that is to engage in that planning early. And, everybody thinks, oh, well, I don't have any money. I don't need a will. And really the powers of attorney get lost in that conversation.
Hmm.
Think estate planning, people think will.
Right.
And it's not about death planning. It's really about life planning.
Yeah.
And yeah, if I could spend a lot of money on a public service campaign, I would do that because it's so important. Because once the person has a need for a caregiver, more often than not, it's too late, especially
Yeah.
when it's a cognitive limitation.
Right.
Mhm.
Can you get into a little bit the nuance between spouses who are providing caregiving, and then can spouses sign over power of attorney on behalf of another spouse? Because I think people think that that can happen. So can you talk about that a little bit?
That's a great point because people do assume because they are married, they can sign for each other, and that is simply not true. Now, there are certain medical decisions that most states do recognize, a medical decision maker. But when we're talking about financial decisions, so I'll give you a funny example. So years ago, right around April 15th, I got a call from an accountant that we work with a lot. And he said, I have Mr. Smith here in my, that's an alias, by the way, Mr. Smith here
Yeah.
in my office. And he has a joint tax return with his wife. And I need to know if he has a power of attorney for her. So I went back in my records. I said, well, yes, he does. Why? And I'll send it over. And he said, well, because Mrs. Smith left on a cruise with her girlfriends a few days ago and failed to stop by my office to sign the joint tax return. So I need to know if I need to put this on extension or not. And I said, nope, he can go ahead and sign for her.
Yeah.
So in that instance, because they had the POA for each other. They had a reciprocal one. It didn't matter. They didn't have to, delay filing the tax return. It could be signed. But I've seen it with real estate settlements all the time in my law firm,
Mhm.
where, two names, husband and wife, they're on the deed. And they're either selling the house or refinancing, and only one shows up at settlement.
Mhm.
And they say, "Oh, well, we're married. I can just sign for her." Well, do you have a power of attorney? No, you can't. So a lot of problems can happen because you have that assumption. So,
Right.
mhm,
So if you don't have a power of attorney in place that points to one another,
mhm.
and one of you becomes incapacitated, you can't then initiate the process for children or nieces or nephews or
Too
grandchildren,
late.
whomever,
It's too
to
late.
do power of attorney on your behalf.
Yep. Guardianship is pretty much the only option if there is a total incapacity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Well, thank you for clarifying that for myself and everyone
Yeah.
who's listening.
Yeah.
Um, again, please make sure you have things lined up when everybody is healthy and there are no problems, because it
And
can make the trying time less complicated.
absolutely. And so many times I see, advice given and it's like, well, we'll get a power of attorney for your parents. And it just makes me cringe when I hear that language used. It should be, no, talk to your parents, encourage them to go, and they need to get the power of attorney. You don't
Mhm.
get it for someone else. You can't have yourself named as someone else's power of attorney. They need to do that.
Mhm.
So, the message should be have these conversations with your parents,
Right.
when they're younger and healthier,
Mhm.
and just have it in place and, put it in a drawer and just know that if there's an accident or a sudden onset of some illness,
Mhm.
it's there as a safety net. And you can act
Yeah.
more quickly. Because the other problem with the guardianship process is it's not quick.
Right.
There is a definite time lag. There are certain provisions for emergency guardianships, but they're temporary.
Mhm.
They're not a long-term solution. And again, you're in court, and guardianship hearings are very emotional.
Mhm.
people don't realize what the impact of having to sit in a courtroom with your loved one. It's usually a parent or sometimes it's a spouse, and hearing medical testimony that the person they love can no longer function.
Right.
And the person is sitting there and they don't generally know why they're there, and there's confusion, and it's a horrible thing to be a part of.
Yeah.
And every judge will tell you that. Every lawyer who's done it will tell you that. Um, if it can be avoided, it really should be.
Yeah.
Just being proactive while you can be. Yeah. Now, that being said, giving power of attorney to the wrong person, we could do a whole other show about that. Um, yeah, I mean, you need to choose very carefully because you are giving that person a lot of power.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's one thing that, we're starting to see, our software can be used to really say in a power of attorney, great, I'm naming you. Because if you have a committee of agents, is what I like to call them, when people come in and say, well, I have 3 children, I want them all to be my power of attorney. It's like, okay, that may
Mm.
work. Sometimes it might just mean you have 3 different opinions and, there's an impasse. But sometimes what we're telling people is, well, look, you can name one, but you can also say the others have to be kept in the loop. And that's where Advocord can really be useful to
Hmm.
say, okay, I'm picking one of you out of convenience, and it's just going to be more expedient to do that. But that
Hmm.
doesn't mean I want the other two to not know what's going on and be involved. And
Right.
then, if the others are backups, alternates, then they're all on the same page as to what's been going on. Because that was one of the things when I designed Advocord, I wanted to design it for that succession planning,
Hmm.
when somebody else took over. Because sometimes something happens to the decision maker. I mean,
Right.
and
Yes.
you might have your system in your desk or on your computer of,
Hmm.
how you keep records. Will somebody else going to be able to figure that out or even have access to it?
Yeah.
So, that's the thing with our platform. There is that ability to hand it off seamlessly and no information is lost, no history is lost. It just goes on. So that was very
Yeah.
important when we designed it.
Well, and you touched on a key phrase that people hear. So just to make sure that they understand and that I'm clear as well, on succession planning, how does that factor in and exactly what is that in the process?
Yeah, so what I mean by that is, if you are the decision maker, you're keeping all the financial records, you know what the financial picture for the person you're caring for looks like.
Mhm.
Um, and suddenly you're hit by a bus. You know? You don't want to have somebody, you're the successor to you, somebody who takes over after you. Usually it's an alternate named in a power of attorney or an alternate guardian that a court appoints. You don't want to have them have to go back and access records, first of all, because
Mhm.
that may not happen. Um, and then try to figure out what it all means. And they don't have
Yeah.
the benefit of your note. So one of the things in Advocord, with every entry for everything, be it an expense or activity, time you're spending with the person, there's an
Mhm.
ability to keep notes and keep a log of your notes. So,
Yeah.
simple things. I had somebody, one of our users, told me that she keeps notes of which bank tellers she wants to do and ask for when she goes in. 'Cause I know they're helpful.
Yeah.
So just silly things like that that can actually
Right.
make life easier, and
Yes.
certainly make the life of a successor easier if they know, whom to call and deal with directly and know that history.
Right.
And we keep a history of what happens to assets in there too.
Mm.
So, once you build your inventory of assets, as
Mhm.
things are sold, it just simply moves to a different screen. So
Yeah.
all that history. So if you sell the car, you're going to move it into, past assets, and it's going to show you, the bill of sale and how much it sold for and where that money went. So again, you're building that history.
Right.
for someone else. So if the successor now has to do that Medicaid application,
Hmm.
it's going to be really easy for them to go back those 5 years and look at that.
Yes.
So, that's one of the things. And obviously destruction of records, cloud-based software, I think, unfortunately, the folks in California are figuring out, you're keeping paper records at home. That's vulnerable.
Yeah.
Um, it really can be. I've had people tell me that now they feel like they can travel a little bit because they know they have everything with them. They have
Hmm.
access to everything. They don't need to travel with, a briefcase full of documents in case there's an emergency with their
Right.
parent away.
Yeah.
So those types of things we've solved for,
Yeah.
which are the shortcomings of the shoe boxes and the box, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, there are so many tethers when
Yes.
you're a caregiver. And
Absolutely.
so to be able to cut those
Mhm.
ties because you have Advocord
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're making it a
is
little easier. We do certainly
is
do
such a
not. I mean,
gift.
the work of being a caregiver is monumental. Our mission is to just say, wait a second, we're going to make this section of it
Mhm.
easier for you, and help guide you so that you don't have to undo things and spend a lot of
Yeah.
money and time in court trying to undo a mistake that was really avoidable, with a
Right.
little bit of knowledge up front.
Yeah. Oh, I said it before, but I will say it again. It's such a gift because one of the things that I think people really lose sleep over is making sure that they do this part right. And so by making it easier and more transparent, not only is it easier and more transparent, but you're removing that anxiety
Mhm.
that lives behind it. And for people like me who will put something off when it is anxiety inducing and then it just snowballs, this is fantastic. And it's also great because not everybody lives where they grew up anymore, right?
Right.
So if you have caregivers who are spread across the country or even a couple of towns away who can't get there for whatever reason on a regular basis, suddenly everybody who has access has visibility, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I will say that we are learning that there is a real time saving too.
Yeah.
I talked to one of our subscribers in North Carolina, and she said she used to spend about 15 hours a month simply informing her siblings about what she was doing. And she said now they have read-only access. Because I don't know, I
Yeah.
touched on that, but our platform does. You can grant read-only access. So they can't go in and change anything, but they can see what you're doing.
Yeah.
And she said, just knowing that I don't have to spend time, you know, copying and emailing records to them and
Mhm.
texting them about, discharge summaries and things like that, because it's on there, they can see it. And she said, we spend much more time discussing what we should be discussing.
Right.
And mhm,
Yeah. Well, and that is huge because it removes the ability of people to say, well, you never told me that. I didn't know.
mhm,
And those kinds of games, number
mhm.
one. And number two, they can see it at their convenience. So not
Yep,
only is it convenient for the person who's inputting all of the information, it's convenient for the person who has a job where they're working second shift and their time is opposite of everybody else's, but they still want to know.
yep, absolutely, absolutely. So
That's
we're
fantastic.
very happy that we can, make a little piece of it better. Um, and there are a lot of great companies attacking other components of it too, and we're just really happy to be in that space. And
Yeah. Well, and that's what I've loved about these conversations that I've been having is people are taking their area of expertise and finding the problem that they can solve
mhm.
with what they know how to do. And the if not me, then who, and if not now, then when a lot of people are answering that call. And
Absolutely.
I'm so happy to have these conversations because when my family's journey started, in 2012, 2013, it was very different. And it doesn't seem that long ago, but in the last 10 plus years, there has been a massive shift. And I think it's a lot to do with the number of people who are providing care. And then professionals like yourself who are seeing this with clients coming in, and you're going, okay, I actually can do something about this. And then taking the next step to do it. And that's really the separating the men from the boys, as they say. Thank you for the work that you've done.
There are certain advantages to being an older founder. I think, you're just a lot braver. I don't know that I
Yeah,
would have done this at 25, but 50, yeah, why not? What have I got to lose, right?
same. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I wouldn't have done it then, but mid 40s, it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm ready.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Um, so I think one of the questions that I want to make sure that we touch on before we wrap up is from a legal perspective or your legal perspective, what are the biggest challenges of caregiving? And is there something in particular? I know we've touched on a lot, but is there something in particular that people should really pay attention to?
I think a lot of people are surprised to find out that there is a risk of personal liability for some missteps. Um, and I'm not talking about, being signing on as a financial guarantor of a, nursing home. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about where a court can say you have mismanaged funds to the detriment of the person you're caring for, to the extent that I'm going to make you make that up. And
Mhm,
that's where that personal liability comes in.
mhm.
And, because I've had, clients say, well, should I get insurance? And there is fiduciary insurance out there. And I would say if you're managing someone with a high net worth and, you're trying to do that, first of all, I'm going to say get really good advisors in that case. Um, but you may want to think about that. In fact, in most states, if you're a court appointed guardian, you're required to post bond against any losses.
Mhm.
So I think that from a legal standpoint is a huge risk. The other risk is a removal from the position. So
Yeah.
if we're not doing things properly, a court can step in and say, even in the case of power of attorney, saying, no, 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 you're not doing this right. So you're out. And when you're out, if there isn't an alternate, well, then it could be a third party that really maybe doesn't know the person very well, or
Yeah.
isn't ideal for other reasons. So those are the things, sort of the one end of the spectrum, the more severe remedies that can happen, and they're really some of the pitfalls. And I think people don't realize that because
Mhm.
the vast majority of people who do this go in, full steam ahead and with the best intentions, and they just want to get things done. And they don't really step back and say, well, wait a second, if I don't do this right, am I in jeopardy? What can happen to me?
Right.
So that's why I said earlier, you really have to take a bit of a defensive posture because legally you are held to the same standards as a professional fiduciary. So somebody who appoints a trust department of a financial institution as their power of attorney, as their agent, is held to the same standard as, the child of the person who maybe has an eighth grade education.
Yeah.
The legal standards are the same. So we're just trying to even that playing field a little bit to
Right.
say, okay, these people have a lot of resources at their disposal. They've had a lot of education, a lot of training. You haven't,
Mhm.
and we know that. But the consequences to you are the same.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things. And I mean, that's the personal risk. The risk to the person you're caring for is loss of benefits.
Mhm.
And, misspending their money can just also, reduce the number of options they have for care as well, which is, hugely detrimental.
Right.
I think anybody who's been in a skilled nursing home understands that there's a world of difference in quality of life in a
Mm.
room that has 4 or 6 beds in it versus a private room. So how are you really maximizing the choices that your loved
Mhm.
one has? So, there's a lot of risk all around, but there's certainly the risk of personal liability on the fiduciary caregiver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mhm. I wanted to get into. Then there's also state rules in a lot of states, most states actually, um, called filial responsibility that say, and they're very old. They come from hundreds of years ago that say an adult child can be held financially responsible for an indigent parent. Um,
Mm.
Now they're on the books in most states, but anybody attuned to legal circles is going to say, but there have been some rumblings where some people are saying, wait a second, if you're mismanaging the money and now they have to go on public assistance, we might look to where that money went.
Right.
So, yeah. So another reason why you want to make defensible decisions about what you're spending the money on as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the big lesson learned here is making sure that you are using professionals who are skilled in elder care, and whatever it costs up front is more than worth its weight in gold to
Good.
ensure that everything is done properly to save you the headache, the financial
Mhm.
challenges, and everything else that comes with it. Um, and of course, planning ahead.
Absolutely. And keeping good records when you do start
Yes,
taking the job on. Yes.
yes.
Protect
And
yourself with good records.
and you can use Advocord for
Use
that.
Advocate. Yes.
And like Nancy said, it's only $4.99 a month, $4.99 a
Mhm.
month, which is for most folks
Yep.
extremely affordable, especially if you're a coffee drinker. Just knock out a cup or two a day and you're good.
That was intentional. We did not want to add to the financial burden of folks.
Well, and
Actually,
it's,
we've had subscribers say, "Why is it only $5 a month? I'm getting far more value out of it."
yeah.
And I said, "Well, that's good. I'd rather have you telling me that than the opposite."
Oh, absolutely. And it's, to be honest, it's one of the primary reasons I wanted to feature you, in addition to the information that you provide. Um,
Yeah.
Caregiving is hard enough,
Hmm.
and to be able to partner with people and recommend services that take that into account um, is something that is very important to me.
Yeah.
So I wanted to thank you personally for making it accessible to as many people as possible.
Well, we are a mission-driven company, so and we understand the work that these folks are doing and these families are doing, and yeah, and there are a lot of limited resources and for the vast majority of them. So
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy Meyers, attorney and founder of Advocord, for joining us on Carefulist, the podcast. We will catch everyone on the next episode. Until then, take care.